The drawings in Marian Ashby's hands were the truest thing she owned, and they were signed with a name that was not hers. She stood on the north bank of the River Wend in the grey light before the ceremony, the rolled load tables pressed against her chest, and she read the signature on the corner the way other people read a death notice. Sir Reginald Crane. Her father had drawn the lines. She had run the figures, and the knighted stranger from London had set his name across the bottom of the page as if the whole bridge had sprung whole from his own clever head. Unsigned. That was the word she carried in her like a stone in a boot. Her work, her father's work, unsigned by either of them, while a man who could not read Scour took the bows. Across the water, the Duke of Wexmoor's new toll bridge stood pale and proud in the dawn. 3 great stone arches over the brown current, and a crowd already gathering for the keystone ceremony. It was beautiful. Marian knew bridges, and she could admit when a thing was beautiful even as she saw it was doomed. Because she had walked the east bank at first light, and she had read the footings, and the footings were a lie. She did not yet say it aloud. She only stood there with the true drawings in her hands, and watched the men in good coats laugh on the bank, and she thought, by the first hard rain, that east pier will be in the river, and not one of you will believe me until it is. To understand how a mason's daughter came to be standing on a riverbank, knowing more than a knight of the realm, you would have to go back into the small stone house at the edge of Marsh Cross, where Jonah Ashby had raised his daughter on chalk and arithmetic instead of lace. Marian had been drawing piers since she was 8 years old. Her father had set her on his knee at the long deal table with a slate, and shown her how a load came down through a stone and spread into the ground, how water did not push a bridge so much as eat the earth from beneath it, slow and patient, season after season, until the day it took everything at once. He called it Scour. He said the river was the only honest engineer in England, because the river never flattered you and never forgave a short footing. He had taught her because he had no son, and because she was quicker than any son would have been, and because in the privacy of that house it did not matter that she was a girl. What mattered was whether the numbers closed. Her numbers always closed. By the time she was 20, her father's eyes had gone, the fine work blurring at the edges, and it was Marian who ruled the load tables and drew the true pier sections, while Jonah dictated from memory and checked her arithmetic by having her read it back. The commissions came in under his name. The drawings went out in her hand. No one outside the stone house ever knew, and no one needed to, because Jonah Ashby's bridges stood, and a bridge that stands is the only reference a builder ever truly has. There was a thing she had learned in those years that the men who later laughed at her had never learned at all, and it was this, that the river always tells you the truth before it does the damage, if you are willing to kneel in the cold and listen. She had learned to read the small signs, the curl of the current where it met a pier, the colour of the water where it carried bedstone away, the way a footing sweats and seeps when the ground beneath it begins to move. Her father called it reading the river. The London men called it nothing because they did not know it existed. They surveyed from the bank in dry weather and went home to draw, and they trusted their figures the way a vain man trusts a mirror, and the river ate their figures one season at a time, and they called the result misfortune. Marian had never once called a fallen bridge misfortune. She had always been able to walk to the wreck and put her hand on the exact stone that failed and say why, and the why was never the weather and never God. The why was always a man who had not listened. Then the Duke of Wexmoor decided to span the Vend. It was to be the making of the market town, that bridge, a toll crossing to carry the wool wagons and the mail coach straight through to the turnpike, instead of the long muddy ford road that flooded 6 months of the year. The young Duke had staked a great deal on it, more than the town knew, but Jonah Ashby had drawn the design, every arch and every footing, with Marian's pencil moving under his blind direction, and the Duke's man had taken the drawings to London to be, the word they used was reviewed, by Sir Reginald Crane, the celebrated engineer whose name alone could reassure a nervous bank. Crane had reviewed them. Crane had also quietly redrawn the East Bank footings to half their depth, because the East Bank was soft alluvial mud that wanted twice the stone, and twice the stone cost money, and the difference between the stone specified and the stone delivered was a sum a man could put in his own pocket if no one ever checked the ledger. Then he had signed the whole design as his own. Jonah Ashby died that winter, before the first arch rose. He never saw the bridge built. He never saw his name struck from his own work. He died believing it would stand, because he had drawn it to stand. She had a memory she kept of him from the last good winter, before the eyes went entirely. A bridge 2 valleys over had begun to settle, a modest stone crossing on the Marsh Cross Road, and the parish had sent for Jonah Ashby, because there was no one else they trusted. He had taken Marian, 16 years old, and they had stood on the bank in a sleeting wind, and he had said, low, so the parish men could not hear, "Tell me what you see, and do not tell me what they want to hear." And she had read the water and the seep on the upstream face, and the fine crack stepping up through the third course, and she had told him the upstream footing was going, slow, and would have a year in it, and no more. He had nodded once and turned to the parish men and said it aloud as his own judgment, and they had thanked him and paid him, and on the cold walk home he had said the only praise he ever gave her plainly. "You read it before I did. You will be better than I ever was, and they will never know it, and you will have to decide if you can live with that." She had told him she could. She had been 16 and had not understood yet what it would cost. The footing went the next autumn, within the month she had named, and the parish rebuilt it on her father's drawing and cut his name in the new stone, and never once thought of the girl who had read it in the sleet. Marian buried him in the parish churchyard with the master stonecutter Eli straddling, holding her steady at the graveside, the only man at the burial who knew what her father had truly been, and what she truly was. "He'd want you to see it raised," Eli had said, his cracked old hand on her shoulder. "Your bridge as much as his." "It is not my bridge," Marian had answered. "It has another man's name on it now." She had not meant to go to the keystone ceremony at all. She had meant to stay in the stone house with her grief and her useless true drawings. But Eli had brought her word 3 days before, word from the quarry from a frightened tally clerk named Davy Coombe, that the foundation stone for the east bank had been paid for in full and delivered by half, and that no one would listen to a clerk, and that someone ought to look at the river before the Duke stood on that bridge and called it finished. So Marian had walked out before dawn and read the east footings with her own eyes and her father's understanding, and now she stood on the north bank with the truth rolled up in her hands, and she made her decision the way she made every decision, without drama and without retreat. She would cross the bridge. She would tell the Duke of Wexmoor that his east pier stood on nothing, and she would do it before the whole county, so that when the river proved her right, there would be witnesses to remember she had said it first. The keystone ceremony had drawn half the county to the south bank, where a striped awning had been raised and a length of crimson ribbon stretched across the bridge mouth to be cut. The peerage stood in their carriages and their good coats. The market townsfolk crowded the verge in their Sunday best, and at the centre of it all, on a low platform beside the eastern parapet, stood Crispin Hale, the Duke of Wexmoor, with a knighted engineer at his shoulder, and the look of a man about to be proved right in public. Marian crossed the span on foot against the flow of the crowd, the rolled drawings under her arm, her plain grey dress marking her out among the silks like a wren among peacocks. People made way for her with the small frowns of people who cannot place a face. By the time she reached the platform, a space had cleared around her, and the Duke had stopped speaking, and every eye on the south bank had turned to the woman in grey who had walked the wrong way up his bridge. "You are interrupting a ceremony," the Duke said. His voice was even, cold, accustomed to closing conversations rather than opening them. "Whatever your business is, it can wait at the steward's office." "It cannot wait, Your Grace." Marian kept her own voice level. She had practised it in her head the whole way across the water. "My business is your east pier. It stands on footings that were never built to specification. If you open this bridge to traffic, it will fall." For a moment, there was only the river sound and the wind in the awning. Then Sir Reginald Crane laughed, a short, indulgent public laugh, the laugh of a man inviting a crowd to laugh with him, and the crowd, uncertain, began to. "And who," said Crane, "is this authority on footings?" "My name is Marian Ashby. My father was Jonah Ashby, who drew this bridge." "Jonah Ashby was a country mason who submitted some preliminary sketches," Crane said smoothly, to the crowd now more than to her. "I corrected them and saw the work built properly. The man is dead, God rest him, and now his daughter comes to a ducal ceremony to make a scene. It is a sad thing. Grief does strange work on a simple mind." The laughter swelled, surer of itself now. Squire Felton, near the front in a mustard waistcoat, laughed loudest of all and said something to his neighbour about the girl wanting a place in service. Marian felt the heat of it move over her skin and did not let it reach her face. She had known it would be like this. She had told herself it would be like this, and she had come anyway. She turned to the Duke. "I'm not asking you to take my word, Your Grace. I'm asking you to send a man down the east face at low water and measure the footing. It will be half the depth the soil requires. The river will undercut it at the first hard rain. I do not want a place in service. I do not want anything from you. I want this bridge not to drop into the Vend with a wagon on it." The Duke looked at her then, really looked, for the space of a breath, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been hesitation. But Crane was already speaking, leaning to the Duke's ear, and the great mechanism of rank and reputation was already grinding back into motion. "Your Grace," Crane murmured just loud enough, "if you halt this ceremony on the say-so of a hysterical girl, in front of every man whose money built it, you will be a laughingstock from here to London. The footings are sound. I staked my name on them." And the Duke chose his name. He chose the knight he had paid for over the woman in grey, the way he had chosen 100 easy certainties before, and he straightened, and he delivered the line that the whole county would remember within a day. "I can find 100 engineers who can raise a bridge," the Duke said, loud and final. "I do not need a mason's daughter to teach me how one falls." It landed exactly as he meant it to. The crowd roared. Squire Felton clapped. Somewhere a woman tittered behind her glove. Marian did not weep. She let the laughter wash over her and break, her face still and her hands quiet. And into the first ebb of it she spoke, and the flatness of her voice was sharper than any shout. "Stone does not care whose daughter I am." The platform quieted to catch it. "Your east pier stands on footings no one ever built, Your Grace. It will fall at the first hard rain where I have marked it." She walked to the eastern parapet. From the pocket of her grey dress she took a stub of red keel chalk, the kind quarrymen used to mark stone, and she knelt and drew a single clean line across the cap of the east pier, just where the parapet met the arch. "It will go here," she said. "Tonight, if the weather holds as it is turning. By midnight, I think. Send your man down at first light tomorrow and measure what is left. Then you will know which of us reads a river." She rose, brushed the chalk dust from her fingers, and walked back across the bridge the way she had come, unhurried, her drawings under her arm, while the county watched her go, and the laughter died into something less comfortable behind her. The rain came at dusk. It was not a storm, only a steady grey rain off the western hills, the kind that does its work quietly. But Marian, who had grown up reading the Vend, knew the rain had been falling in the high country for 2 days already, and she knew what was coming down the valley behind it. She sat at her father's long deal table with a single candle, and the true drawings spread before her, and she did not sleep, and she did not pray, because prayer was for things you could not calculate, and she had already done the arithmetic. By 10 o'clock the river had risen brown and loud past the stone house. By 11 she heard it working, that deep grinding undernote a river makes when it is moving the bed itself, when it is reaching under a footing and pulling out the ground a handful at a time. She thought of the Duke in his great house, sleeping the sleep of a man who had been reassured. She thought of her father, who had drawn the east pier to stand 100 years. At a little before midnight the sound came. Not a crash. Bridges do not crash, whatever the ballads say. It was a long, low, tearing groan, stone grinding against stone as the undercut footing gave, and the great mass of the east pier leaned, hung for an impossible moment against the current, and then settled into the river with a sound like the whole valley exhaling. Then the nearer arch, robbed of its bearing, came down after it in a slow collapse of masonry and white water, and then there was only the rain and the river running louder than before. Marian sat very still in the candlelight. There was no triumph in her. She had loved that bridge. Her father had drawn it. She had only wanted them to listen. She was on the bank before first light with her surveying chain and her level and a lantern, working in the grey drizzle while the water still ran high, and that was where the demonstration of her competence truly happened, not in the falling of the pier, which any fool could now see, but in the cold, methodical reading of the wreck that followed. She took the floodmark survey while the evidence was fresh. She measured the height the water had reached against the surviving abutment, the wet line still dark on the stone before the sun could fade it. She measured the angle of the collapse and the line of the scour pit the river had dug, pacing the chain out along the bank and writing each length in the wet notebook with a pencil that smeared in the drizzle. She sounded the depth of the pit with a weighted line, lowering it hand over hand until it touched, and read off the figure, and frowned, and read it again, because the river had dug exactly as deep as her father's tables had said an undercut footing would let it. The river had not been violent. The river had been patient and arithmetical, and it had simply taken the ground from under a footing that did not reach the ground that holds. She found the broken footing stones in the shallows and measured their depth, and she laid her tape across the stump of the east pier where it had sheared, and she read, in the raw broken stone, exactly what she had known the morning before. A footing, built to half the depth the soil demanded, sheared clean along the line where the river had reached under it and taken the ground away. The break itself told the whole story to anyone who could read a break. A footing that has been undermined does not crush. It tilts and tears, the stone parting along the bedding where the support fell away, and that was the face this stone showed her. Not the explosion of an overloaded pier, but the clean lean of a foundation that had simply run out of ground. She traced the fracture with one cold finger and felt, under the grief, the bleak satisfaction of a thing understood completely. There was nothing here she had not predicted. There was nothing here a competent man could not have predicted. That was the worst of it. And she found the chalk. Her red keel line drawn across the pier cap the day before was still there on the largest fallen block, lying in the shallows. The river had taken the pier and dropped it, and her mark had ridden it down, and it sat now above the waterline for any man to read. The failure had come exactly where she had marked it, to the inch. The crowd came with the daylight, first the townsfolk, then the quality, drawn by the rumour that ran through Marsh Cross faster than the flood. They gathered on the bank above the wreck, and they fell silent in a way that Marian felt at her back without turning. The day before they had laughed. Now they stood looking at the gap where a bridge had been, and at the woman in grey kneeling in the shallows with a measuring chain, and not one of them could find a thing to say. Eli Stradling came down the bank to her, his old face grim, and crouched beside her at the water's edge. "They're saying you witched it," he said quietly. "They would rather believe I witched it than that I read it," Marian answered, not looking up from her chain. "It is easier on them." She wrote a figure in her wet notebook. "Send for Davy Combe. Tell him to bring the tally ledgers, every page, and to keep them dry. Before the day is out, someone with a title is going to want to know how a knighted engineer's bridge fell down, and I want the truth on the table before anyone has time to invent a flood that never came." Up on the bank, unseen by her, the Duke of Wexmoor sat his horse at the edge of the silent crowd and looked at the gap in his bridge, and the woman in the river who had told him, to the hour, that it would be there. The Duke did not go home that morning. He sent his household ahead, and he rode the long way, alone, up onto the chalk ridge above the Vend where a man could see the whole valley and the wound in it, and he sat his horse there in the thinning rain for a long time with no one to perform his composure for, and let himself understand what he had done. He had built the bridge to be more than his father's son. That was the truth he had carried so carefully that he had never once set it down and looked at it. The old Duke had spent the estate's strength on horses and cards, and the good opinion of men who despised him, and had died leaving Crispin a great name lashed to a mortgaged carcass, debts in every drawer, tenants on land that needed money it did not have. The bridge was to have been the turn of the tide, a toll crossing, the wool trade redirected, the town grown rich and the estate with it. Proof, public and permanent, that the new Duke was a builder where his father had been a waster. He had needed it to be a triumph so badly that he had bought the most expensive name in England to stand behind it, and had never once asked himself whether the name and the work were the same thing. I read the reputation, he thought, looking down at the gap. I never read the river. He thought of the woman in grey. He had wanted her to be a hysteric, because a hysteric was easy, and a hysteric cost him nothing. He made himself remember her instead as she had actually been, not weeping, not pleading, only standing there with her drawings and telling him, in a voice with no heat in it at all, precisely what would happen and precisely when. He had answered her with a clever, cruel line and 100 imaginary engineers, and the county had laughed, and he had felt, for one shameful warm moment, like a man in command of his world. She had knelt and marked the stone. She had named the hour, and the river had kept her appointment, and not his. He turned the thing over and over and could find no comfortable place to set it down. It would have been easier if she had been wrong in some part, if the pier had fallen elsewhere, if he could tell himself she had merely guessed. But she had marked the very stone. That was not a guess. That was knowledge of a kind he did not possess and had mocked in public, knowledge that had been standing right in front of him, offered freely, and he had chosen the knight's flattery over it because the flattery let him keep his pride one day longer. He made himself walk back through the whole of it, the way she would no doubt walk back through the wreck with her chain, refusing to look away from any part. He had not even examined the footings himself. That was the rot at the centre of it. He had stood on a bridge he had bankrupted himself to build, and he had not once climbed down to the water and looked at the thing his money had bought, because looking was beneath a duke, because looking was what one paid Sir Reginald Crane to do. He had purchased a pair of eyes and then trusted them more than his own, and the eyes had been a thief's. A man who would not look could be sold anything. His father had never looked either, had signed the leases and the notes and the markers his stewards put in front of him, trusting the name on the paper instead of the figure on it, and had looked up one day to find the estate gone out from under him like ground under an undercut footing. Crispin had sworn since boyhood that he was the opposite of that man, and here was the proof, in the gap in his bridge, that he was that man exactly. He had simply changed the table the cards were played on. He thought of Crane, who had staked his name on the footings. He thought of the word the townsfolk would soon be saying, were perhaps already saying, that the great London engineer's bridge had dropped into the Vend with the paint barely dry, and that a country girl had called it to the hour. And under the shame, slow and unwelcome and undeniable, came something else. She was the only person living who had read the bridge truly. His father had drawn it to stand. Crane had cut it to fall. And Marian Ashby had read both the drawing and the river and known the difference. If the bridge was ever to be rebuilt, and it must be rebuilt, the estate could not survive its failure, only its recovery. Then the one mind in England that could rebuild it was the one he had laughed at on the bank. He had ridden up the ridge a humiliated man. He rode down it a man with something to do, and the urgency of it took him like a fever, because she had refused him once already and owed him nothing, and a woman who owed him nothing might very well be gone by morning. I have to find her, he thought, before she decides she is finished with us. And he put his horse down the slope toward the town faster than the footing liked. He came to the stone house at the edge of Marsh Cross on foot, having left his horse at the inn, his good coat dark with rain at the shoulders, and his boots ruined with the lane's mud, and he knocked on a tradesman's door for the first time in his life, and waited to be admitted like any other caller. Eli Stradling opened it, took one long look at the Duke of Wexmoor standing hat in hand in the rain, and did not hurry to stand aside. "She's at her table," the old man said. "She's had a hard day being right. Mind how you go." Inside, the low room was warm with a fire and bright with candles, and Marian Ashby sat at the long deal table with her wet notebook open, and the true drawings weighted flat at the corners, and she did not rise when the Duke came in. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the bridge, level and unafraid, and she waited. He had meant to say a great many things on the walk over. He had composed and discarded a dozen graceful approaches. Standing in front of her, with her father's drawings on the table between them, and her chalk line proved by the river, he found that all the graceful approaches were just more of the same flattery he had bought from Crane, and that she would see through every one of them, and that she deserved better than to be managed. So he said the plainest, hardest thing instead. "You were right." His voice was not steady, and he let it not be. "The river took the east pier at midnight, exactly where you mark the stone. I read the reputation. I should have read the river." Marian said nothing. She had not expected an apology, and an apology was not what she was weighing. She was weighing whether the man who had given it meant to act differently or only to feel better. "I have measured the wreck," she said at last. "Would you like to know why it fell, Your Grace, or only that it did? Tell me." He drew the chair out from the table, then stopped himself, hand on the back of it, aware that he had not been offered it. "May I sit?" The asking landed harder than the apology had. A duke who asked leave to sit at a mason's table was a duke who had felt the floor move under him. Marian gestured at the chair and he took it, and only then did she answer his question. "The east bank is soft. Old river mud, 100 feet down before you reach anything that will hold. A footing on that ground wants depth, twice the stone of the west bank, which sits on chalk. My father drew it that way. The footing that was built was half the depth my father specified. She turned a page of the notebook and laid a figure in front of him, then another. Half the stone. The other half was paid for. I have a quarry clerk who kept the delivery tally, and who can show you that the foundation stone for the east bank was bought in full and delivered by half. The difference did not go into the river, your grace. It went into a pocket. The Duke looked at the figures for a long time. Crane, he said. Sir Reginald Crane signed the design as his own, having cut my father's footings to make himself a private prophet, and trusting that no one would ever read the river closely enough to catch him. My father drew a bridge to stand. Crane built one to fall and put both their names to neither. She closed the notebook. Mine was on it too, somewhere underneath. I ran every figure on that drawing. None of it was signed by the people who did it. There it was again, the Duke thought. Unsigned. He had heard the bitterness under the flat voice now, and understood it was the oldest wound she carried, and the truest. Then you will help me hang him with it, the Duke said. I have no interest in hanging anyone. Marian folded her hands on the table. I have an interest in a bridge that stands. The two may happen to run together. But understand me, your grace. I will not do this to revenge my father. My father needs no revenge. He drew a true bridge, and a true bridge is its own monument. I will do it because the town needs the crossing, and because I am the only person living who can give it to them properly, and for no other reason. The Duke set his ruined hat on the table, there in the low candlelight, at the level of the deal table where her father had taught her arithmetic, a man and not a title for the first time in her sight of him, and that small thing was not lost on her. Then let me say it the right way, he said. I am not offering you employment, Miss Ashby. I am offering you the works, as the one person living who can build them, on equal terms. It was the offer she had not let herself expect. Not a place in service, not charity dressed as rescue. The works, the whole rebuilding, hers to command. She did not seize it. She had learned long ago that the moment you show hunger is the moment a powerful man remembers he holds the bread. On equal terms, she repeated. Those words are easy to say across a table at night. Let me tell you what they will cost you in daylight, and then you may decide whether you meant them. She rose now, and went to the drawings, and laid her hand flat on her father's lines. Then I will build your bridge, but my name is cut into the foundation stone beside my father's, and you will never again sign what you cannot read. Those are my terms. The Duke looked up at her across the candlelight. My name beside his, in the stone, where every man who laughed at the water's edge can see it, she went on. Not your name, not Crane's. Ashby, twice. And from this day, no specification, no drawing, no account of these works carries your signature unless you have read it through and understood every figure on it yourself, so that you never again stake your house on a name you bought instead of a thing you know. If you cannot give me that, give me my hat and find your 100 engineers, and good luck to you. For a moment the old reflex moved in him, the instinct that a duke does not take conditions from a mason's daughter, that he sets terms and others meet them. He felt it rise, and he recognized it for what it was, the same reflex that had made him choose Crane's flattery on the bridge, and he put it down. My father signed everything, and read nothing, the Duke said slowly. It is exactly how he lost the estate. I have spent my whole life swearing I was not him, and yesterday on that bridge I was him to the letter. He stood, and he held out his hand across the table, level, as to an equal. Ashby twice in the stone, and I will read every line or I will not sign it. You have my word, and you will have it in writing, in my own hand, which you may keep. Marian looked at the offered hand. Then she took it, once, firmly, and let it go. Then we have a bridge to build, she said. The months that followed turned the wreck on the Vend into the most closely watched works in the county, and turned two people who had met as insult and injury into something neither of them had a name for yet. It began with the river. Before a single new stone could be cut, Marian made the Duke walk the east bank with her at low water, and she taught him to read what she read, not as a duke being humoured, but as an apprentice being held to account, because she had made him swear he would understand every figure, and she did not intend to let the oath go soft. She showed him the soft mud and the chalk, the scour pit the river had dug, the difference between ground that holds and ground that flows. She made him put his hand into the cold bank and feel where the mud ended. She set him problems on the slate the way her father had set them to her, and when he got them wrong she told him so plainly. And the strange thing was that he came back the next day having learned them, and the day after that with questions she had to think to answer. "You are a better pupil than half the men who train for this," she told him once, surprised into honesty. "I am a man with everything riding on one bridge," he answered, "and a teacher who does not flatter. It concentrates the attention." Eli Stradling and his stonecutters came on as the masonry crew, glad to be building an Ashby bridge again, and openly delighted to be doing it for a duke who had to ask the master cutter's leave before he touched a tool. The new east footings went down to the full depth her father had drawn, twice the stone of the west bank, and Marian stood on the staging at low water with the coal to her knees and checked every course herself, and the duke stood beside her in clothes that grew rougher and more honest by the week, holding the lantern, learning, and slowly ceasing to be a man she had to manage. The formal distance went first. She had called him Your Grace for 2 months out of armour as much as custom, a way of keeping him at the length where he could not surprise her. It was on the scaffolding, late, both of them soaked to the skin after saving a fresh footing from a flash rise of the river, by working side by side in the dark, with no one to see which of them had a title. It was there, when the water had finally dropped and the stone had held and they sat exhausted on the staging, laughing at nothing out of pure relief, that she heard herself say his name, just Crispin, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He went still for a moment. Then he said, "I have been waiting some weeks to hear that," and the plainness of it, the lack of any triumph in it, undid something in her she had kept carefully tied. They began to take their meals together, which was a small revolution no one remarked on and everyone noticed. At first it had been practical. The work ran long, the light was short, and it made no sense for the master of works and the man footing the bills to walk off to separate tables when there was bread and cold meat to be shared on an upturned barrel by the staging. But practicality became habit, and habit became something warmer, and there came an evening when Eli Stradling looked over and saw the Duke of Wexmoor laughing at something the Ashby girl had said, with his mouth full and his good name entirely forgotten, and the old stonecutter said nothing, but he smiled into his cup. They confided things in the long working hours that neither had said aloud before. He told her about his father, the cards and the horses and the great name lashed to a ruin, the terror he had carried since he was a boy that the rot was in the blood and he would prove it in the end. She told him about the stone house and the slate and the slow blinding of her father's eyes, the years of doing the work under another man's name, and watching that name take the credit, the particular loneliness of being exactly right and entirely invisible. "You were never invisible," he said. "You were unseen. Those are different things. The first is in you. The second was the fault of the men looking. You were one of them." "I was the worst of them," he agreed without excuse. "I am trying to be the man who looked twice. It is harder than it sounds, and I do not always manage it, and I would rather you tell me when I fail than spare me." "I have never spared anyone in my life," Marian said, and he laughed, the real laugh, the one she had decided she liked. There were the smaller things, too, that built the partnership stone by stone the way the bridge was built, course by course. There was the morning Marian caught a fault in a delivered batch of stone. A softer, cheaper grade slipped in among the good, the same trick on a smaller scale that Crane had worked on the whole bridge, and she had the cart turned around in the lane and sent back to the quarry with a note that made the quarrymaster blush to read it, and Crispin watched her do it, and understood that she would have caught Crane in a single season if anyone had ever let her near the books. There was the evening he came to the works straight from a hard meeting with the bank in the county town, grey with the strain of holding the loan together long enough for the bridge to start earning, and she did not offer him comfort, which he would not have known what to do with, but laid the schedule of works in front of him, and showed him, in figures he could now read for himself, exactly how many weeks until the tolls began, and exactly how the sums closed, and the cold arithmetic steadied him more than any kindness could have. There was the day Squire Felton rode out to sneer at the works and called across the river, loud enough to carry, that the Duke had taken to playing at builders with a tradesman's girl, and Crispin had walked to the bank and answered him, cold and plain, that the tradesman's girl had read his bridge truer than any knight in England, and that Felton might keep a civil tongue on Wexmoor ground, or take himself off it, and Marian, on the staging below, had gone on checking her course and pretended not to have heard, and had thought privately that the man was learning to spend his rank on the right things at last. There was an afternoon near the top of the work when the keystone of the new east arch was set, and the crew let out a ragged cheer, and Marian stood back on the bank to see the span closed and whole again, her father's bridge risen a second time, built true at last, and found the whole span had gone blurred and swimming in front of her, and was furious with herself because weeping was the one thing she had always refused to do. Crispin came and stood beside her, not touching her, looking at the bridge with her. He would have liked to see it, he said quietly. Your father. Yes. I am sorry he cannot, and I am glad past saying that you can. He paused. I have been trying for a month to imagine these works without you in them, Miss Ashby, and I find I cannot do it. Not the bridge, the works and the days and the slate problems, and being told plainly when I am a fool. I cannot imagine any of it without you, and I have stopped trying to. She had no answer ready, and she did not trust her voice to make one, but she stayed where she was, close beside him, and they stood together on the bank a long while in the ordinary evening, and the thing between them, still unnamed, settled deeper into both of them like a footing finding solid ground. The reckoning and the sealing came on the same day because Marian had arranged it so, the way she arranged everything, deliberately, with the evidence dry and the witnesses assembled and nothing left to chance. The rebuilt bridge was to be reopened before the whole county. The same crowd that had laughed on the bank a season before now summoned back to see the span made whole. The Duke had let it be known that Sir Reginald Crane was invited to attend the reopening of the bridge that bore his name. Crane, who had spent the season in London assuring everyone that the failure had been an act of God, a freak flood no engineer could have foreseen, came down to Marsh Cross to take a bow in front of the county, never dreaming the bow had been arranged as a noose. The crowd gathered on the south bank as it had before, the carriages and the good coats, Squire Felton in another loud waistcoat, the townsfolk thick along the verge. The new bridge stood pale and perfect over the Vend, and on the platform beside the east parapet stood the Duke of Wexmoor, and at his shoulder this time, where Crane had stood before, stood Marian Ashby in her plain grey dress. The Duke did not begin with grace. He began with the truth, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of the crowd. A season ago I stood on this spot, he said, and a woman came to me with the truth, and I laughed at her, and I told the county I could find 100 engineers, but did not need a mason's daughter to teach me how a bridge falls. That night the bridge fell, exactly where she marked the stone, exactly at the hour she named. I was wrong in front of all of you, and I will be right in front of all of you now, because a man who is wrong in public owes the truth in public. A murmur went along the bank. It was one thing for a duke to rebuild a fallen bridge. Men did that. It was another for a duke to climb up before the whole county and name his own folly with no one forcing him to. Squire Felton, who had laughed loudest the first time, found he had nothing ready to say. The Dowager Duchess, seated in the foremost carriage, inclined her head a fraction, which from her was applause. The crowd had gone very quiet. Crane, near the platform, had begun to smile a fixed and careful smile. This bridge did not fall to an act of God, the Duke went on. It fell because its footings were built to half the depth they were drawn. Half the foundation stone was paid for and never delivered. There is a man here who kept the tally. Davy Combe, come up. Davy Combe, the quarry clerk, climbed onto the platform with his face white and his ledgers clutched to his chest, and Marian gave him one steady nod, and he opened the books and read them out in a thin, clear voice. The dates, the loads of foundation stone ordered for the east bank, the sums paid in full from the Duke's account, and beside each one the loads actually carted to the site, which came to half, never more than half, every delivery short and every short delivery signed for by the same hand. "Whose hand, Davy?" said Marian. "Sir Reginald Crane's, miss," said Davy Combe. "He took the deliveries himself and signed the short tallies himself and told me the books were no concern of a clerk's." A sound went through the crowd then, low and ugly, the sound of a great many people turning at once against a man they had admired an hour before. Crane's careful smile was gone. "This is a fabrication," he said loudly. "A forged ledger, a country grudge, a duke embarrassed by an accident and looking for a scapegoat." "Then read this," said Marian, and she stepped forward and laid 2 drawings on the rail of the platform where the front of the crowd could see them. "The original design for this bridge, drawn in my hand under my father's direction, with the east footings at full depth, dated and witnessed before this bridge was ever built, and beside it the altered specification that went to the site, with the east footings cut to half. In your hand, Sir Reginald, over your signature. The river has already told the county which drawing was true. The paper only tells them who changed it." Crane looked at the 2 drawings, and at the ledgers, and at the faces of the men whose money had paid for stone that had gone into his pocket instead of the river, and he found nothing to say, because there was nothing to say. He turned, and he pushed back through a crowd that did not make way for him kindly, and that was the last the county saw of Sir Reginald Crane. The Duke let the silence settle. Then he turned to Marian, and he spoke not for the crowd now, but to her, though every soul on the bank heard it. "They have heard who built this bridge falsely," he said. "Now they will hear who built it true." He raised his voice once more. The works on the Vend were rebuilt under the direction of Marian Ashby, Master of Works, daughter of Jonah Ashby, who drew it. Her name and her father's are cut into the foundation stone of the East Pier, where they will stand as long as the bridge stands, which on her arithmetic is 100 years. He looked back at her. "I told you once I could find 100 engineers. I was a fool. There was only ever one, and I had laughed at her on this spot. I do not want 100 engineers, Miss Ashby. I want the one, in the works, and out of them, for the rest of my life." Marian Ashby, who did not weep, came very close to it then, and held it, and answered him in front of the county the only way she knew how, which was plainly and truly. "You once told me to know my place," she said, though it had been Felton's word more than his, the whole county's word, and they all knew she meant the lot of them. "I know my place now. It is here, at the centre of this span, with my name in the stone beneath it. If you want me beside you, Crispin, then it is as this, as your equal, as the woman who built the thing you stand on, and never again as a mason's daughter you were generous enough to notice. As my equal," he said. "I never wanted you any other way. I only had to be unmade to learn it." He did not kiss her then. That was for later, in the ordinary evening away from the crowd. He held out his hand instead, there on the platform, level, as to an equal, the same gesture he had offered across the deal table on the worst night of his pride. And she took it, before the whole county that had laughed, and the handshake meant everything that the kiss would only confirm. 1 full year later, the spring floods came down the Vend as they always did, high and brown and patient, the same water that had once taken a pier to the river in a single night. The East Pier did not so much as tremble. Marian stood at the centre of the span in the early light, and watched the river do its worst against the footings her father had drawn and she had built, twice the stone of the west bank, down past the soft mud to the ground that holds, and the bridge carried the weight of the morning as if the flood were no more than weather, which to a true footing it is. A loaded wool waggon came across behind her, and then the mail coach, 4 horses at a brisk trot, the heaviest regular load the crossing would ever bear, and the span took it without a sound or a shiver, and the guard touched his hat to the woman at the parapet without knowing she was the reason his coach was dry. Sir Reginald Crane had been struck from the engineer's rolls within the month, and had left England altogether, gone to wherever men go when their name has been the only thing they ever truly built, and the name is broken. No one in the county spoke of him except as a caution. The Dowager Duchess of Wexmoor, who had been the first in that great house to take Marian seriously, and to say at her own dinner table that the girl had more sense than every man who had laughed at her, had lived to see her son married to his Master of Works, and had pronounced herself entirely satisfied, which from the Dowager was something near to rapture. Marian was the Duke's wife now, and is named Master of Works still, which mattered to her rather more, and the 2 titles sat together without the smallest difficulty, because the man who had given her the second had finally understood that it was the one that meant equal. Crispin read every line before he signed it. He had grown almost tiresome about it, Eli Stradling said, forever wanting to understand the arithmetic, and Marian said, let him be tiresome, it was the best fault a duke ever had. There was one thing left undone, and she had left it undone on purpose. On the west abutment, low, where the old footing met the new work, a single course of the original bridge still stood, the one part of Crane's Bridge that had been built honestly, because it sat on chalk, and even a thief could not have made it fail. Marian had ordered it left in place rather than rebuilt, rough and weathered against the clean new stone. The masons had wanted to face it over to match. She had refused. Let it stand, she had told Eli, a little ugly, a little out of true, where anyone who knows to look can see the seam between the bridge a man built to steal and the bridge a woman built to last. It was not a monument, and it was not a grudge. It was a fact left in the open, the way she had left every fact in the open, and she meant to leave it there as long as she lived. She walked to the eastern end of the span, to the foundation stone, where the morning sun reached it, and she crouched the way she had once crouched to draw a chalk line, and she ran her fingers over the letters cut deep into the stone. 2 names, Jonah Ashby, Marian Ashby, her father's hand and her own, signed at last in the one ink no man could alter and no reputation could steal, cut into the very ground the bridge stood on, where the river itself would have to undo the whole works to undo the credit. Unsigned she had been, the morning she first stood on this bank with the true drawings in her hands, and another man's name across the bottom. Signed now, in stone, for as long as the stone stood. They had laughed at the mason's daughter at the water's edge. No one laughed when the span she built carried the mail coach across the Vend without a single tremor, her name and her father's cut deep in the stone beneath it. The woman who had been told to know her place stood at the centre of the span she had made, an equal in fact as well as in name, and watched the market traffic of the town cross over on the strength of her arithmetic, and was, for the first time in her life, both seen and signed. The river ran on beneath high and honest and held its peace because the footings were true,